In 1930, Miami stood at a crossroads between illusion and survival. The land boom had collapsed, the Great Hurricane had scarred the coast, and now the Great Depression tightened its grip. Yet palm trees still lined the boulevards, steamships still docked in the harbor, and tourists still stepped off trains believing in sunshine. Beneath that brightness, the city was learning how fragile prosperity could be. In 1930, Miami was still young enough to feel unfinished. The city had incorporated only 34 years earlier, and much of its identity had been shaped in the wild rush of the Florida land boom during the mid-1920s. That boom had promised effortless wealth under tropical skies, drawing investors from New York, Chicago, and beyond. By 1930, those promises lay scattered across half-built subdivisions and empty lots where streets had been paved for houses that never came. The skyline was modest but ambitious. A few mid-rise hotels and office buildings rose above Biscayne Bay, their stucco facades reflecting a Mediterranean revival style that developers believed suited the subtropical climate. Along Flagler Street, storefronts sold linens, cigars, and imported goods. The city's name still carried the aura of speculation, but the atmosphere had shifted. The crash of 1929 had not begun Miami's hardship. It merely deepened wounds already opened when the land bubble burst years earlier. The population hovered around 110,000 within city limits, though Greater Miami, including Miami Beach and Coral Gables, expanded that figure significantly. Many residents had arrived chasing quick returns and stayed because departure required money they no longer had. Others had come for health, escaping northern winters or tuberculosis, believing the warm air might restore them. The city was a mixture of Midwestern retirees, Southern laborers, Bahamian migrants, Cuban merchants, and a small but growing black community confined by segregation to neighborhoods such as Overtown. Transportation defined daily rhythm. The Florida East Coast Railway still brought winter visitors down from the Northeast. Long passenger trains rolled into the station carrying tourists in linen suits and straw hats, though fewer than during the height of the boom. Steamships docked at the port, connecting Miami to Havana and Nassau. Automobiles, once symbols of prosperity, were now practical necessities. Dusty roads linked Miami to farming communities in the Everglades and to Miami Beach across the causeways. The Great Depression revealed itself not in dramatic collapse, but in slow contraction. Construction halted on several projects. Real estate offices that had once operated on every corner closed quietly. Banks tightened lending, and some failed entirely. Lines formed outside relief offices as unemployed laborers sought assistance, yet the city did not appear abandoned. Palm trees still swayed, and hotel lobbies remained polished, projecting continuity even as occupancy rates dropped. Tourism, though diminished, remained Miami's lifeline. Northern newspapers still advertised winter sunshine. Wealthier visitors continued to escape icy streets for Art Deco hotels emerging along Ocean Drive in Miami Beach. The contrast was stark. Beyond the bright facades lay neighborhoods where residents struggled to pay rent. Service workers, maids, porters, cooks depended on the seasonal influx. When winter visitors were scarce, so were wages. Agriculture provided another foundation. South of the city, in the muck lands near the Everglades, farmers harvested tomatoes, beans, and citrus. Produce shipments moved north by rail. The 1926 hurricane had devastated large areas, and recovery was ongoing in 1930. Labor in these fields was physically demanding and poorly paid. Migrant workers lived in simple wooden structures, vulnerable to storms and flooding. Still, the agricultural trade prevented Miami from collapsing entirely into speculation. Prohibition shaped the city's undercurrent. Though officially dry, Miami's proximity to the Caribbean made enforcement difficult. Rumrunners used the coastline and inlets to bring liquor from the Bahamas and Cuba. Small boats navigated Biscayne Bay under cover of darkness. Speakeasies operated discreetly behind legitimate storefronts. Law enforcement oscillated between enforcement and tolerance, depending on political winds. For some, illicit trade offered income when legitimate jobs disappeared. Race and segregation structured daily life. Black residents, many of Bahamian descent, were restricted to Overtown and faced discriminatory laws and practices. They worked primarily in service industries, construction, and domestic labor. Churches and social clubs provided cohesion and mutual support. Despite hardship, Overtown developed its own commercial vitality, with small businesses lining Northwest 2nd Avenue. Yet inequality was visible in infrastructure, schooling, and public services. Cuban influence, though not yet dominant as it would later become, was present through merchants and cigar makers. Spanish was heard in certain neighborhoods and along the docks. Trade with Havana remained active, and steamships connected the cities regularly. The Caribbean was not distant from Miami. It was part of its economic and cultural circulation. Municipal government faced mounting fiscal pressure. Tax revenues fell as property values declined. Public works slowed, though some infrastructure projects continued in modest form. The city sought to maintain its image, understanding that perception influenced tourism. Promotional materials emphasized beaches, fishing, and tropical leisure rather than unemployment statistics. Architecture in 1930, Miami reflected optimism that predated the crash. Mediterranean revival homes in Coral Gables, developed by George Merrick during the boom, stood as evidence of ambitious planning. Many houses were occupied, but others remained vacant or sold at reduced prices. In Miami Beach, early Art Deco influences began to shape hotel design, though the district's full transformation would emerge later in the decade. Daily life revolved around adaptation. Housewives budgeted carefully, stretching groceries and preserving food. Men who had once speculated in land now searched for steady wages. Boarding houses took in additional tenants to offset lost income. Churches reported increased attendance as uncertainty grew. Yet the climate imposed a different tempo from northern cities. Hardship unfolded under bright sunlight, without the visual drama of snow-covered breadlines. Education continued in public schools, though funding constraints limited expansion. The University of Miami had not yet opened. It would be founded in 1925, but delayed operations due to financial difficulties, finally beginning classes in 1926. By 1930, it remained small and financially precarious, reflecting the broader instability of the region. Entertainment persisted in quieter forms. Movie theaters screened Hollywood features, offering affordable escape. Fishing charters operated from the docks, catering to tourists who could still afford leisure. Dance halls and small clubs provided music, sometimes featuring jazz carried south from northern circuits. Even in economic downturn, social life did not vanish. It adjusted. The memory of the 1926 hurricane lingered. Many buildings bore signs of repair. Insurance costs had risen, and confidence in coastal construction had been shaken. Residents watched the Atlantic with vigilance during storm season. The vulnerability of a coastal city was no abstraction, it was recent experience. Miami in 1930 was neither the glittering fantasy of brochures nor a city in ruins. It was a place recalibrating expectations. The speculative frenzy had subsided. The Great Depression imposed discipline. Those who remained did so out of necessity or conviction. The streets were quieter than in the boom years, but they were not silent. Commerce continued at a reduced scale. The port operated, trains arrived. The sun rose over Biscayne Bay each morning as it always had, indifferent to balance sheets. The city's future felt uncertain but not impossible. Miami had been built on risk from the beginning, carved from swampland through ambition and engineering. That impulse had not disappeared, it had merely paused. In 1930, the promise of perpetual growth had been replaced by a more sober calculation. Survival required patience, and patience was something Miami was only beginning to learn. By mid-1930, the national downturn had tightened its grip, and Miami felt the weight in practical ways. Employment in construction, once the engine of local prosperity, had dwindled dramatically. Bricklayers, carpenters, and plasterers who had migrated south during the boom now competed for scarce jobs. Some left for other states, others stayed, unwilling or unable to finance relocation. Laborers gathered at docks and public squares in the early morning, waiting for day work that might not come. The banking sector reflected the strain. Smaller institutions struggled as depositors withdrew funds, fearing insolvency. Confidence, once eroded, was difficult to restore. When banks closed, even temporarily, rumor traveled quickly through neighborhoods. Miami's earlier exposure to financial collapse during the land bust had made residents cautious, but it had not insulated them from the national crisis. Yet the city's geographic position provided limited insulation. Unlike heavily industrial northern centers, Miami did not rely on large factories. Its economy was built on services, tourism, trade, and agriculture. That structure meant unemployment did not spike in the dramatic, factory-closing fashion scene in Detroit or Pittsburgh. Instead, income thinned gradually. Hotel staff saw hours reduced. Retail clerks worked shorter shifts. Farmers received lower prices for crops shipped north. Miami Beach in 1930 presented a carefully maintained facade. Hotels advertised ocean views and winter sunshine. Wealthy visitors still arrived, though in smaller numbers. For them, the Depression was an abstraction measured in stock portfolios rather than empty cupboards. Their presence created an uneven cityscape. Polished dining rooms serving seafood and cocktails discreetly poured despite prohibition. Only a few miles from families, stretching meals with beans and rice. Local newspapers balanced optimism with caution. Headlines promoted civic events, fishing tournaments, and charitable drives. Beneath the surface, editorials urged fiscal prudence. Civic leaders understood that reputation influenced survival. If Miami were perceived as failing, tourism would decline further. Public messaging emphasized resilience. Charity organizations expanded their reach. Churches organized food distribution. Women's groups arranged clothing drives. Mutual aid within ethnic and racial communities became essential. In Overtown, fraternal organizations and churches supported members facing eviction or illness. Among Bahamian-descended residents, kinship networks provided informal loans and shared housing. Public works would later expand significantly under New Deal programs, but in 1930, those initiatives had not yet materialized. Federal intervention remained limited. The city relied on its own constrained budget. Infrastructure improvements slowed, though maintenance continued where possible. Roads were repaired and public buildings kept operational, but grand new projects were postponed. The Everglades loomed just west of the city, both resource and threat. Drainage canals, carved in previous decades to convert wetlands into farmland, required upkeep. Flood control remained an ongoing challenge. Farmers depended on stable water levels. Too much or too little could destroy crops. In 1930, agricultural production was steady but vulnerable to price fluctuations beyond local control. Culturally, Miami existed at an intersection. Southern traditions mingled with Caribbean rhythms. Spanish-language commerce coexisted with Midwestern accents. On the docks, sailors spoke in multiple languages. The city had not yet become the international hub it would later be, but the seeds were present in 1930, visible in trade patterns and migration routes. Housing conditions varied sharply. Mediterranean-style homes in Coral Gables stood on landscaped avenues, though some were repossessed or sold at reduced prices. In working-class districts, wooden houses showed wear from humidity and storms. Boarding arrangements increased as families sought supplemental income. Rent delinquency rose, but mass evictions were tempered by landlords aware that vacant properties generated no revenue. Education persisted despite strain. Public schools operated on tight budgets. Teachers accepted modest salaries, sometimes delayed. Attendance fluctuated as older children left school to contribute to family income. The concept of adolescence as extended schooling gave way to economic necessity for many. Recreation maintained a quiet presence. Beaches remained open and free. Fishing along piers required minimal expense. Churches organized picnics. Movie theaters, offering inexpensive tickets, drew audiences seeking distraction from financial anxiety. The climate allowed outdoor life year-round, which reduced heating costs and made informal gatherings common. Crime patterns shifted subtly. Petty theft increased as hardship grew. Bootlegging remained active, though enforcement varied. The coastline's geography, with its inlets and proximity to the Bahamas, continued to facilitate smuggling. For some, illicit trade provided survival income. For authorities, it posed ongoing challenges. Politically, local leadership navigated uncertainty. The national election of 1930 did not bring immediate relief. Confidence in existing economic systems weakened, though alternatives were not yet fully articulated. Miami residents, like others across the country, debated responsibility and remedy in barber shops, church halls, and hotel lobbies. The psychological climate of 1930 Miami was defined less by despair than by recalibration. Residents who had witnessed the collapse of the land boom had already learned that rapid expansion could reverse quickly. The Great Depression reinforced that lesson on a national scale. Expectations adjusted downward, plans were deferred, survival became the immediate objective. Still, the essential features of Miami endured. The Atlantic remained a source of trade and recreation. Biscayne Bay reflected the skyline each evening. Trains continued their southbound journeys, even if carriages were less crowded. Farmers planted crops despite low prices, trusting in eventual recovery. Hotel operators polished brass fixtures, anticipating the next winter season. Miami in 1930 was not the mythic playground it had once marketed itself to be, nor was it a city defeated. It existed in suspension, between speculative past and uncertain future. Its residents negotiated hardship under open skies, constructing routines that balanced realism with persistence. The city's youth worked in its favor. It had fewer entrenched systems to dismantle and a population accustomed to change. What defined Miami that year was not spectacle but endurance. Streets remained lined with palms planted during optimistic years. Buildings erected in confidence still stood, though sometimes half empty. Boats moved through the harbor. Voices in English, Spanish, and Creole mingled in markets. The Depression had narrowed opportunity, but it had not erased movement. By the close of 1930, no one could predict the duration of the downturn. Yet Miami's pattern was already emerging. Adapt, preserve image, rely on climate and geography, and wait. The city had been built on improbable ambition carved from swamp and shoreline. That ambition no longer promised instant wealth. Instead, it sustained a quieter conviction that the sun would continue to rise over Biscayne Bay, and that, in time, visitors and prosperity might return with it.